Let's go traveling with Paul to Jerusalem, to a situation that he had known for some time. It had been prophesied, Prophet Agabus specifically telling him and others that he's going to suffer at Jerusalem. But Paul was determined to do the will of God. So let's follow him. Luke gives us a rather detailed account of these eventful occurrences in Jerusalem. This is the time that the conflict with the Jews reaches its apex. And so Luke says in Acts 21, verse 15, after these days, and if you remember, we left off with Paul and his company being at Caesarea. So he says, after these days, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. Note the map down below. Of course, you know that if you go to Jerusalem, you're going up. If you go away from Jerusalem, you're going down. And even though Caesarea, as you can see, is north of Jerusalem, they went up to Jerusalem. And some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Mnason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we should lodge. When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God. And they said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They're all zealous for the law. And they've been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Thus, all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself live in observation of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. Then Paul took them in, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled and the offering presented for each one of them. So we need to have a little comment here, backing away from the text. First of all, we don't know who Mnason was. I think it's implied that he probably was wealthy. He's a Christian very early, had been a disciple for some time, and Paul and his group stayed with him. And that would suggest he had a large house. We also read that Mnason came from Cyprus, an early disciple, and the gospel went early to Cyprus. From Jerusalem, after the persecution that arose caused by Paul, some of the disciples went and spoke to the Jews there, not yet to the Gentiles. And then Paul and Barnabas went to Cyprus. Of course, Barnabas came from Cyprus. And so the gospel has been established there for some time. We don't know any more about Mnason other than that. Now, James, you can see, is a spokesman. At this point, he is the leading elder of the church in Jerusalem. Now, who is James? There are a number of Jameses. Perhaps, and I'm going to say probably, he's James, the Lord's brother, who's called an apostle in Galatians 1:19. Regardless of which James he was, he is in authority in Jerusalem, and he is the spokesman for the church. Now, everything began rather well. In the slide that just talks about what Paul said, and the initial reaction is they glorified God. They're very happy. We could have stopped there, but James went on to make a suggestion, and it has some distressing implications. It seems that a rumor had reached the church in Jerusalem and the Jewish members of the church in Jerusalem in particular, that Paul had denounced Judaism, that he was teaching that the Jews should not circumcise their children, they should not observe the law. Now, of course, that's just patently false. Paul had not done such a thing as that. But it had stirred up some controversy in Jerusalem among the Christian Jews there. And James' advice to Paul is to go with 4 men who had a vow. And at the end of the vow, the persons making it would go to the temple and would shave their heads, and they would pay a certain amount of money as a contribution to the temple in carrying out their vows. And so the suggestion that James made was go with these guys. And then everybody will know that you have not denounced Judaism, that you're still a faithful Jew. Well, Paul did that. Ultimately, it resulted in his arrest. Now, that sounds terrible, of course, but remember, everything is working according to God's sovereign plan, and God had told Paul, you are going to suffer in the course of your ministry. So let's go back to the text now as Luke continues the narrative. When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is a man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously sent Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. Of course, the temple's long gone, destroyed in 70. The only part remaining is the Wailing Wall, which is just a portion of the outer wall. So here is an artist's conception, a model of the temple in its glory, beautiful building. And as Luke continues, as they were seeking to kill him, now, of course, this would be not Christian Jews, but Jews that are not Christians, but they are, of course, have heard this rumor. So as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks, the Council Antonia, the location of the Roman army in Jerusalem, right next to the temple. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd, for the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him!" As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" Now, obviously, he spoke to him in Greek. "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hands to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. Now, some comment. Note again, something we've seen all the way through this scenario as Luke has given it to us, that the opposition primarily comes to Paul from Hellenistic Jews. These are Jews brought up in the Greco-Roman world. They're not brought up in the Jewish city of Jerusalem or in Judea. They're out there in the society that is not Jewish. And of course, there is anti-Semitism out there. And they're very sensitive. In fact, I think paranoid of the fact that there might be some problem caused by the fact they're Jews and they'd be identified as such. And so consequently, Christianity coming from Judaism would scare them, would cause them to think, now we'll possibly be persecuted. Now that's a conclusion that many scholars have reached about this feeling that the Hellenistic Jews had toward Christianity. But whatever the cause was, the opposition comes from Hellenistic Jews, in this case from Jews from the province of Asia. The closing of the gates of the temple were probably the result of the thought of a Gentile being there. This idea that Trophimus had come into the Ephesian, had come with Paul into the temple, was being spread about. Of course, that was not true. He was in Jerusalem, he was not in the temple. So these false rumors continued. Now, of course, the tribune's totally confused, but he was amazed when Paul spoke to him in Greek and concluded that he was not the rabble rouser. He rather was from Tarsus, and the fact that he came from Tarsus would be impressive because of the reputation of that city, the very favorable reputation of that city. Now, the tribune is a military tribune. You see an illustration on the right. The military tribunes held a rank between a centurion and legate. The centurion in the Roman army commanded 100 men, hence century. The legate commanded a legion, and that's 6,000 men. The word tribune derives from tribe. And originally there were 3 tribes, and the number grew in time. There were 2 kinds of tribunes. There were the tribunes of the people who were involved in politics in Rome and had a good deal of power. But the military tribunes came from the middle class, the equestrian class, and their position was often seen as a stepping stone to the Senate. Now, traditionally, 6 of these military tribunes were appointed to each legion. And they really came to be more political than military in function, but they still are military. They have that assignment. And Claudius Lysias, who is named here, was a tribune of the cohort. There were 10 cohorts to a legion, and each cohort was 600 men. There would be, of course, 6 centuries within a cohort. So the cohorts of the legion could command between 600 and 1,000 men. I think in Jerusalem, probably it's more likely 1,000 men. So Claudius Lysias is simply called in the translations the tribune. Now in Greek, that's kileiarchos. Archos is the word for ruler, and kilia is 1,000. So we speak of kiliarch, ruler of 1,000. And the term is used 16 times in the book of Acts between chapters 21 and 24. So we would conclude that Claudius Lysias is the commander of 1,000 men. He's defined as a high-ranking military official in charge of anywhere from 600 to 1,000, I think 1,000. He's called tribune of the cohort in Acts 21:3. And of course, the cohort was a 10th part of the Roman legion. Now, from his comments to Paul, it may be inferred that he had bribed the Emperor Claudius by making large gifts to him. Claudius was known to promote men in this way. We'll see exactly what that involves in just a moment. Now, this is a model of the Fortress Antonia in Jerusalem as it would have existed in the time of Paul, a very massive building where all of the soldiers were located, right next to the temple. Today, there's you see these arrows pointing to some of the ruins, part of the wall of the Fortress Antonia. There's some pictures, fragments of that building that still remain. Going back to Luke's narrative now, and this is Paul speaking from the steps of the Castle Antonia. He said, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven shone around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go into Damascus, and there it will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to every one of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, or I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Now, up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging to see and find out why they were shouting against him like this. But when they'd stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, Is it lawful for you to flog a man who's a Roman citizen and uncondemned? When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen. So the tribune came and said to him, Tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, Yes. The tribune answered, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. Paul said, But I am a citizen by birth. So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. And looking intently at the council, Paul said, Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. Now we need to stop and make some observations. The Roman law offered considerable protection to its citizens. Not everybody at this time living within the Roman Empire was a citizen, and citizenship was a precious thing. Citizens were always allowed attorneys to defend them if they were arrested, and no attorney was given to Paul. They were not to be mistreated, meaning they were not to be beaten, they were not to be tortured. Paul was about to be flogged. When sentences to death were passed, they could be commuted. They usually were commuted. Very seldom do Roman citizens suffer the capital punishment. And all of these laws that protected the citizens were the result of years of progressive legislation that favored the people, passed by the Roman Senate. And thus, it's a great thing to be a citizen, and they have rights. And Claudius Lysias was in the process of violating the rights of a Roman citizen. Now, I mentioned a moment ago the situation with Claudius Lysias. He purchased his citizenship with money. In fact, he offered a bribe, no doubt, to Claudius. On the other hand, Paul says, I was born a citizen. Now, if you're born a citizen, both of your parents had to be citizens. That means Paul's father, Paul's mother, maybe Paul's sister as well, were citizens. Additionally, living in Tarsus in Cilicia offered a good deal of prestige because of that city. And there were different levels of citizenship. All citizens were protected, but some citizens, like those in the Latin-speaking areas, would get more recognition in society. And all citizens had the right of appeal. And they could even appeal up to the final court of appeal, so to speak, and that was the emperor. In this case, it's Nero. That would be Paul's right as a citizen, and he used that right. So we continue. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it's written, you shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people. Now, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he'd said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, for the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, we find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. I might say this is a masterful piece of strategy that Paul used. When he divided the council by saying he was a Pharisee, perceiving that some were Sadducees and some Pharisees, then their attention was to fight each other rather than him. Continuing the narrative now from Luke, the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who had made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we're ready to kill him before he comes near. Now, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you. The tribune took him by the hand and going aside, asked him privately, what is it that you have to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them. For more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. Now they are ready, waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, tell no one that you have informed me of these things. Then he called 2 of the centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers. Remember, centurions command 100 soldiers, with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix, the governor. You see the military armor that the military tribunes wore. And he, Claudius Lysias, wrote a letter to this effect. Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. And so Paul goes from Jerusalem back to Caesarea. And at this point, Rome is now directly, intricately involved in Paul's case. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. On the next day, they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I'll give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. Now here you see a map going from Jerusalem to Caesarea, of course, going down from Jerusalem to Caesarea, which is north. And they split the journey. Remember, they left by night. They just had to get him out of the city under cover of darkness because his life was in danger. So there are 200 soldiers, 2 centurions, along with 70 horsemen, and they spend the night in Antipatris. Now the soldiers returned to Jerusalem. The reason they would do that is that the danger was no longer present because he was far removed from Jerusalem and the crowd's not going to follow him that far. So they don't need the soldiers to protect him at that point. So he goes from Antipatris the next day, the 35 miles remaining to Caesarea. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. I read that with some exaggeration because this is nothing but pure naked flattery as far as Tertullus is concerned. And he continues, but to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly, for we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. So this is their prosecuting attorney, if you please. And Luke adds, the Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so, which of course they were not. Now, a little bit about Antonius Felix. He was born somewhere between 5 and 10 AD. He was the fourth Roman procurator of the province of Judea, and that was between 52 and 60. Now, who were procurators? Well, the curators are people who worked in administrative positions, usually in finance. Of course, pro would mean he's out in the provinces. And procurators were not governors. He's called a governor, but that's not his official position. They were agents who assisted, especially in financial matters, and could be delegated administrative authority, in which case, with Felix, he was. He was serving as a governor. Now, Felix was the younger brother of the Greek freedman Marcus Antonius Paulus. Now, Paulus served as secretary of the treasury during the reign of Claudius. That's a very high governmental position. Now, let me pause for a moment to go back to Claudius Lysias, who bought his citizenship and no doubt took the name of Claudius because it is thought that he bribed Claudius to get that position. Claudius was an excellent emperor and ruled between 42 and 54. But he was very clever in that he selected people from the lower class, in this case, slaves, and he freed them and put them in high positions. And they, of course, were so grateful to Claudius that they would serve him faithfully. He could count on their loyalty, as he could count on the loyalty of someone like Claudius Lysias, who paid him money for his position. And Claudius Lysias would not forget the fact that he was a citizen by virtue of Claudius's kindness. Very good policy that he had. Now, since his brother, Paulus, was a former slave, I see no reason to conclude otherwise than that Felix himself was once a slave and was freed. Now, we note also his term was marked with cruelty and bribery, including the death, I will say the murder, of the high priest Jonathan. Now, if you back up to what we read a moment ago about the fact that Paul did not realize that Ananias was high priest, there's a reason for it. Jonathan had been the high priest, the official high priest, and had been murdered. And the time that Paul had been gone, things were happening and very rapidly in the high priesthood. It was changing. Now, Paul's defense before Felix. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you've been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues of the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult, but some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and make an accusation should they have anything against me, or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you this day. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, And he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I'll summon you." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. So he sent him for him often and conversed with him. Please notice before we leave this, I've underlined reasoned. You find that when Paul was addressing Jews or addressing people acquainted with Judaism, he will use reasoning, he will use logic based on the scriptures. In this case, we know that he's talking about righteousness, self-control, and coming judgment. And of course, he would use a scriptural basis for that. So in dealing with the Jews and convincing them, he is always using reason. He can't do that with the Gentiles because there's not a common base that he can begin from. And of course, in this case, although we don't know about Felix's beliefs, we do know from what Luke said that he had an accurate knowledge of the way and that his wife, Drusilla, was a Jew. So after 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Now, 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking him as a favor against Paul, that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush, another ambush, if you please. They were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. They were quite determined. They did not, of course, accomplish that. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So he said, "Let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him." After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me?" But Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar." Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed. To Caesar you shall go." What about Porcius Festus? We don't know much about him. I suggest that since his name, his clan name, the second name that Romans had, the first name doesn't appear here. It could have been Gaius or Marcus, but he belonged to the Porcius clan. That is one of the most respected, one of the oldest aristocratic families in Rome. Very different from Felix. And Porcius Festus was the 5th procurator of Judea from about 59 to 62, succeeding Antoninus Felix. And when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, They brought no charge in his case of such evils as I had supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he'd done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. Who is Herod Agrippa? Herod Agrippa II was the last ruler of the Herodian dynasty, and he reigned in Judea. He was born 27 and he died in 92. He was the son of Herod Agrippa I, of course. He's the son of Herod the Great. Herod Agrippa II was the brother of Bernice and of Drusilla, the second wife of the Roman procurator Antoninus Felix, whom we met earlier. He was educated at the court of the Emperor Claudius. You see how so much goes back to Claudius. He favored the Jews. We have no indication that he himself is a Jew. In 55, the Emperor Nero added several territories to his realm, and he spent vast sums of money beautifying Jerusalem, building up the temple, among other things. Now, this meeting with Paul took place either 59 or 60. So that really identifies for us the time that Paul is now appearing before him. So Agrippa said to Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself. And then Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense. And before we read it, I will say this is one of the most passionate, emotional addresses that we'll find Paul making. He made a very personal plea, a strong plea to Agrippa to accept Christ. Why did he do that? Because of his knowledge of Christ, his knowledge of the scriptures. To what extent he believed them, we do not know. Paul said, I know you do believe them, but at any rate, he is certainly reasoning with him on the basis of scripture. So let's listen to what he said. I consider myself fortunate that it's before you, King Agrippa, I'm going to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, especially because you are familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. My manner of life from my youth, spent from the beginning among my own nation and in Jerusalem, is known by all the Jews. They have known for a long time, if they're willing to testify, that according to the strictest party of our religion, I have lived as a Pharisee. And now I stand here on trial because of my hope in the promise made by God to our fathers, to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly worship night and day. And for this hope, I am accused by Jews, O king. Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth, and I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme. And in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. In this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and at midday, O king, I saw on the way light from heaven, brighter than the sun that shone around me and those who journeyed. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goad. And I said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to do those things in which I'll appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles to whom I'm sending you, to open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place by faith in me. Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, and throughout all the region of Judea, and also to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds in keeping with their repentance. For this reason, the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. To this day, I have had the help that comes from God. And so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. And as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. But Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational words. For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul said, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. Then the king rose, and the governor and Bernice, and those who were sitting with him. And when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And we'll follow him to Rome and see what happens there.